He was a titan of industry, a man who could move markets with a whisper. But the one person he failed to see was the woman sleeping beside him. To billionaire Alistair Hawthorne, his wife Madeline was just another beautiful acquisition, a quiet and graceful ornament for his lavish life. He ignored her ideas, dismissed her passions, and paraded his indiscretions in front of her confident. She was too timid to ever challenge him. But he never thought to ask about the secrets she kept locked behind her gentle smile. Tonight, at his spectacular annual charity gala, in a room filled with the world's most powerful people, he's about to learn that the shadow he cast for years was the perfect place for his wife to build an empire of her own. The silence in the Hawthorne penthouse was a specific kind of loud. It was the sound of unspoken disappointments, of conversations that died before they began, and of the vast, marble-floored distance between two people sharing a life, but not a connection. Madeline Beaumont. For 5 years, Mrs. Alistair Hawthorne knew its every nuance. She could trace its echoes from the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city to the cold, minimalist art Alistair had chosen for the walls. The art, like everything else, was an investment chosen for its projected value, not for the soul it might possess. Madeline was in many ways just another piece in his collection. He had pursued her with the same relentless focus he applied to a corporate acquisition. She was an art history graduate working at a small, respected gallery. He'd found her intelligence and gentle nature a charming novelty, a respite from the sharp-edged, ambitious women who typically vied for his attention. He'd called her his serene sanctuary, but sanctuaries by their nature are meant to be quiet, to be still. And for 5 years, Madeline had been just that. Her days were a meticulously scheduled rotation of charity luncheons, board meetings for foundations where her only role was to smile and nod, and fittings with designers who dressed her in the image Alistair preferred, elegant, understated, and utterly safe. Her opinions, once the very thing he'd claimed to admire, were now treated as mild interruptions. "I was thinking for the Hawthorne Foundation Gala this year," she began one evening over a dinner they rarely shared. "Alone we could highlight emerging artists. We could dedicate a wing to showcasing their work, give them a platform. It would align with my background and bring a fresh energy to the event." Alistair didn't look up from the financial report on his tablet. "The gala is for our established donors, Madeline. They want to see Warhols and Rothkos on the auction block, not canvases from some unknown kid in a warehouse. It's about prestige, not energy." He waved a dismissive hand, the gesture so casual it was almost crueler than a direct insult. He wasn't arguing. He was correcting a child's naive suggestion. The conversation, as it always did, evaporated. His neglect wasn't always passive. It had a sharper, more public edge in the form of Bianca Valenti. A sleek, raven-haired socialite with a viper's smile, Bianca was everything Madeline was not: loud, ostentatious, and unapologetically transactional. She was the vice president of marketing at Hawthorne Industries, a position Alistair had created for her. It was a poorly kept secret that their professional relationship extended far beyond the boardroom. Alistair would laugh at Bianca's cutting jokes at dinner parties, jokes often subtly aimed at Madeline's quaint interests. He'd place his hand on the small of Bianca's back, a gesture of casual ownership that sent a ripple of knowing glances through their social circle. He did it all under the guise of professional familiarity, but everyone saw it for what it was: a humiliation. Madeline endured it with a quiet grace that was frequently mistaken for weakness. She would offer a tight, polite smile, her posture perfect, her composure a shield. But behind her calm blue eyes A ledger was being kept. Every dismissive word, every condescending glance, every moment, she was made to feel like a ghost in her own life, was recorded in meticulous detail. The upcoming Hawthorne Foundation. Gala was the pinnacle of their social calendar, and this year the tension was thicker than ever. It was the one night Alistair needed her to play the part of the perfect adoring wife flawlessly. The event was securing a massive merger, and image was everything. "Darling," he'd said, finally looking at her a week before the event, his eyes scanning her as if assessing a stock price. "Make sure you wear the sapphire necklace. It projects stability." He wasn't asking her to look beautiful for him or for them. He was instructing her on how to be a better asset. That afternoon, Madeline was in her private study, a small sunlit room Alistair rarely entered. It was the only space that felt truly hers, filled with books on art history, and more recently, economics and corporate law. She was on a secure video call. Her expression transformed. The soft, placid mask she wore in public was gone, replaced by a look of sharp, focused intelligence. On the screen was a kind-faced older man in a conservative suit. The final block of shares was acquired this morning. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Mr. Peterson said, his voice calm and steady. "The portfolio is diversified, and the holding company is completely insulated as of 8:15 a.m. You are officially the majority stakeholder." Madeline felt a tremor, not of fear, but of power run through her. "And there is no paper trail leading back to me." "None whatsoever," he confirmed. "The Orion Investment Group is as anonymous as a ghost. To the world, it's just another aggressive, faceless fund that saw an opportunity. No one knows it's run by a woman they believe spends her days planning flower arrangements." She allowed herself a small, cold smile. For months, this had been her real life. The lonely nights Alistair was working late with Bianca were her study sessions. The charity luncheons were her cover for discreet meetings. The endless hours she spent alone in the silent penthouse were filled with the thrill of a secret war, a campaign waged in stealth. Alistair thought she was a piece in his collection. He was about to find out she was the collector. And she was coming for the one thing he valued more than anything in the world, his unshakable control. The gala was in 3 days. The stage was set. The catalyst, the single moment that fractured Madeline's quiet endurance and set her on a new path, hadn't been a grand cinematic betrayal. It was a small, slicing remark, delivered with casual cruelty, that finally broke the spell of her passivity. It happened 2 months before her secret acquisitions began. Alistair was hosting an intimate dinner for a potential business partner, a gruff old-money industrialist named Robert Vance. Madeline had carefully planned the menu, overseen the decor, and researched Vance's interests, hoping to contribute to the conversation in a meaningful way. Throughout the evening, Alistair steered the conversation exclusively to finance mergers and market projections fields in which Madeline was presumed to be an illiterate bystander. When Vance, trying to be polite, turned to her and asked about her work at the art gallery. Before her marriage, Madeline's face lit up. "I was a curator for contemporary sculpture," she began, her voice filled with a warmth that had been absent for years. "My focus was on postmodernist artists who work with reclaimed materials. There's a fascinating movement that explores the intersection of sustainability and—" Alistair cut her off with a booming, indulgent laugh. "Madeline, please. Don't bore Robert with your little hobbies." He turned to Vance, a conspiratorial smirk on his face. "She has a good heart, but her passions are—" quaint. I married her for her taste, not her portfolio analysis." The table fell silent. The air crackled with Madeline's humiliation. It wasn't just that he had dismissed her. He had framed her life's passion as a trivial, childish pastime in front of a stranger. He had reduced her entire identity to that of a decorative object he had acquired. In that moment, watching him laugh with Vance, she saw her marriage for what it truly was: a gilded cage where the bars were made of his condescension. She excused herself from the table with practiced poise, her back straight, her head held high. But once in the solitude of her study, the facade crumbled. The quiet sadness she had lived with for years curdled into a cold, hard knot of anger. It wasn't just about Alistair and Bianca anymore. It was about the slow, systematic erasure of her own self. The next day, she began to dig. She started with her own finances, a subject Alistair had always handled. He'd set up a generous allowance for her, an amount designed to keep her comfortable and incurious. But Madeline wasn't interested in the allowance. She was looking for something else, a loose thread from her past. She found it in a dusty box of documents from her grandmother's estate. Her grandmother, a woman Alistair had dismissed as a simple schoolteacher, had been a quiet, shrewd investor her whole life. Tucked away in a forgotten trust, untouched and accumulating value for over a decade, was an inheritance. It wasn't billionaire wealth, but it was substantial, far more than Alistair could ever imagine a simple schoolteacher possessing. It was a secret nest egg left to her, with a handwritten note: "For a day when you decide to build a world of your own." That day had arrived. Her grandmother's lawyer had long since retired, but his firm was still active. With trembling hands, Madeline made a call and was referred to the firm's most discreet senior wealth manager, a man named Arthur Peterson. When they met in a quiet, anonymous office downtown, Mr. Peterson was exactly what she had hoped for: old school, impeccably professional, and with eyes that seemed to understand everything without her having to say a word. He reviewed the portfolio her grandmother had left her. "Your grandmother was a very wise woman, Mrs. Hawthorne," he said, looking at her over his spectacles. "She invested in foundational tech and biotech long before they were fashionable. This portfolio is not just solid, it's a launch pad." Madeline took a deep breath. "Mr. Peterson, I am not looking to fund a shopping habit or a new charity. I'm looking to make a strategic acquisition. I want to build something. But it must be done in absolute secrecy. My husband cannot know. No one can." Mr. Peterson didn't flinch. He simply nodded, a glimmer of respect in his eyes. He had seen enough of the world of powerful men and their often overlooked wives to grasp the situation immediately. "Secrecy is a service we provide. Mrs. Hawthorne, tell me, what is the target?" This was the moment. This was where the vague sense of rebellion solidified into a concrete plan. She thought about Alistair's world, his obsessions, his vulnerabilities. His latest fixation was the hostile takeover of a mid-sized, innovative green energy company, Helios Innovations. Alistair wanted to acquire it, strip its valuable patents for his own tech division, and shutter the rest. It was a ruthless, predatory move, typical of his business style. But Madeline knew something Alistair didn't. Her father, an engineering professor who had passed away years ago, had been a mentor to the founder of Helios. She knew the company wasn't just a collection of patents. It was a team of brilliant people dedicated to a cause. Gutting it would be an act of corporate vandalism. "Helios Innovations," Madeline said, her voice steady and clear. "I want to buy a controlling interest before my husband can, and then I want to use that position to invest in them to make them untouchable." Mr. Peterson raised an eyebrow, intrigued. This wasn't just a spiteful whim. It was a sophisticated, multi-layered strategy. It was both a defensive move to protect a legacy she cared about and a direct offensive strike at the heart of Alistair's current ambition. "That is a very ambitious play, Mrs. Hawthorne," he said slowly. "Hawthorne Industries has formidable resources. But they are loud about it." Madeline countered, a new confidence sparking within her. "They move like a predator, and everyone can see them coming. We will move like a ghost. We will use a holding company, an anonymous entity. We will buy small, untraceable blocks of shares through various brokers. He won't see us until it's too late." For the first time in years, Madeline felt the thrill of her own intellect, the power of her own agency. She was no longer a quaint hobbyist. She was a strategist. The seed of rebellion had taken root, and it was growing into an oak tree of formidable strength, right in the shadow of the man who thought her nothing more than a delicate flower. For the next 6 months, Madeline Hawthorne lived a meticulously crafted double life. To Alistair and their glittering social circle, she remained the serene, almost invisible wife. She attended her luncheons, smiled placidly at board meetings, and nodded along as Alistair pontificated about his business triumphs. Her placid exterior was the perfect camouflage. No one looks for a shark in a koi pond. But the moment she was alone in her study, the transformation was absolute. The room became her war room. The art history books were joined by texts on securities law, market analysis, and corporate governance. Her laptop, once used for emailing caterers, now glowed with encrypted messaging apps and real-time stock tickers. Her partnership with Mr. Peterson was a masterclass in discretion. They never met in person again. Their communication was a complex dance of burner phones, secure video conferences and messages passed through a trusted courier who believed he was delivering rare art auction catalogues. Mr. Peterson, energized by a challenge he hadn't experienced in years, became her tutor and field marshal. "Alistair's strategy is a frontal assault," he explained during one of their late-night calls as Madeline sat in her silk dressing gown studying spreadsheets. "He's driving down the stock price, with negative press likely leaked by his own people to make the acquisition cheaper. He thinks he's the only player at the table." "Then we won't sit at the table," Madeline replied, her voice low and steady. "We'll buy the chairs from under him." Her plan was brilliant in its subtlety. Through the Shell Corporation, they'd created the Orion Investment Group they began to buy. They didn't purchase large, attention-grabbing blocks of Helios stock. Instead, they executed hundreds of small purchases through a dozen different brokerage firms, always staying just below the percentage that would trigger a mandatory SEC disclosure. It was a death by 1,000 cuts. Madeline learned to read the market's rhythms to anticipate Alistair's moves. She discovered she had a natural, intuitive grasp of strategy, a skill honed by years of navigating the complex and treacherous social politics of Alistair's world. She knew how to be patient, how to wait for the perfect moment to strike. One afternoon, Bianca sauntered into the penthouse, ostensibly to drop off some files for Alistair. She found Madeline in the living room, sketching in a notebook. "Still drawing your little flowers?" Madeline Bianca purred, glancing at the page with a condescending smirk. "How lovely. Alistair is closing the biggest deal of his career, and you're doodling." Madeline looked up, her expression unreadable. The drawing wasn't of flowers. It was a complex flow chart, a map of shell corporations and holding patterns disguised with petals and leaves. "Everyone needs a creative outlet, Bianca," she said softly. The ignorance of her rivals was her greatest weapon. They saw a quiet, artistic woman and couldn't imagine the mind of a predator lurking beneath. The stress was immense, but it was a different kind of stress from the soul-crushing weight of her marriage. This was the sharp, exhilarating stress of high stakes of purpose. Some nights she would barely sleep, her mind racing with numbers and strategies. She would watch Alistair sleeping beside her, this powerful man, so completely oblivious to the storm she was gathering around him, and feel a cold, clear sense of purpose. He had underestimated her. It would be his undoing. The final piece of her plan was about Helios itself. Using an alias, she opened a back channel of communication with Helios's CEO, a brilliant but beleaguered scientist named Dr. Eris Thorne. She introduced herself as a representative of a private investment group that believed in his vision and wanted to help him fight off the hostile takeover. "Hawthorne doesn't want your technology," she wrote in an encrypted email. "He wants your patents. He will gut your research department and fire your team. We want to fund it. We want to see you grow." Thorne, initially skeptical, was desperate. He saw a lifeline. Madeline, through Orion, provided him with enough capital to shore up his company's immediate finances, a move that slightly boosted the stock price and made Alistair's acquisition efforts more expensive and frustrating. Alistair, furious at this mysterious interference, simply doubled down on his aggressive tactics, making him even more predictable. He was playing checkers, convinced he was a king. Madeline was playing chess, and she was already 3 moves from checkmate. A week before the gala, Mr. Peterson confirmed the final transaction. "It's done, Mrs. Hawthorne. Orion Investment Group now controls 52% of Helios Innovations. You are the silent majority owner. The company is yours." Madeline closed her eyes, letting the reality of her victory wash over her. She had done it. She had secretly moved millions of dollars, outmaneuvered one of the most ruthless billionaires in the country, and saved a company she believed in. Now only the final act remained. It was time to step out of the shadows. She opened her closet, pushing past the muted, elegant dresses Alistair preferred. In the very back, preserved in a garment bag, was a dress she had bought herself years ago but had never dared to wear. It was a bold, stunning creation of deep crimson silk that shimmered like liquid fire. It was not the dress of a serene sanctuary. It was the dress of a queen. The day of the Hawthorne Foundation gala arrived with a palpable sense of electricity. For Alistair, it was the culmination of months of work, the night he would unofficially celebrate his impending conquest of Helios Innovations in front of the world that mattered. For Madeline, it was the day the world would be redrawn. The penthouse was a flurry of activity. Stylists, caterers, and assistants buzzed in and out, their movements orchestrated by Alistair's imperious commands. He stood in the center of it all, a king surveying his court, barking orders into his phone. He was so consumed by the evening's performance that he barely registered his wife's presence. Madeline moved through the chaos with a preternatural calm. She approved the final floral arrangements, confirmed the seating chart, and handled a last-minute crisis with the orchestra, all with the quiet efficiency he had long taken for granted. This was her role, the silent, competent manager of his domestic and social life. Tonight, she would play it to perfection one last time. An hour before they were due to leave, Alistair strode into their master suite. Madeline was sitting at her vanity, her hair already styled in an elegant but severe chignon. He was already in his tuxedo, looking sharp, powerful, and utterly self-absorbed. "Is everything handled?" he asked, not as a question, but as a demand for confirmation. He adjusted his cufflinks in the mirror, his eyes on his own reflection. "Everything is in order," Madeline replied, her voice even. He finally glanced at her, or rather at the space she occupied. "Good. Don't forget the sapphires. We need to project an image of unbreakable strength tonight. This merger is as good as done, but appearances are crucial." He saw the sapphire box on her vanity and nodded in satisfaction. He didn't notice the empty space beside it, where the crimson dress she planned to wear should have been hanging. He didn't notice the new steely resolve in her eyes. He didn't see her at all. He only saw a component of his grand design. "I have to get to the venue early," he announced, checking his watch. "Need to glad hand some board members before the chaos begins. The driver will be back for you in 30 minutes. Don't be late." He leaned down, not for a kiss, but to give her a dry, perfunctory peck on the cheek. It felt like a corporate seal of approval. "Break a leg, darling," he murmured, the irony lost on him. Then he was gone, his brisk footsteps echoing down the marble hallway, leaving behind the familiar ringing silence. The moment the door clicked shut, Madeline's entire demeanor shifted. The stillness broke, replaced by a swift, deliberate purpose. She walked to her closet and took out the crimson dress. It was a statement piece, a work of art designed to be seen, not overlooked. It was a declaration. As she stepped into the silk, she felt as if she were shedding a skin she had worn for 5 long years. The demure, understated Mrs. Hawthorne was disappearing, and the real Madeline Beaumont was re-emerging stronger, sharper, and forged in the fires of her husband's neglect. She bypassed the sapphire necklace, the symbol of the stability he wanted to project. Instead, she chose a single, stunning piece of jewelry. Her grandmother had left her a diamond necklace designed like a serpent, its eyes tiny emeralds. It was bold, a little dangerous, and entirely her own. When she looked in the mirror, the woman staring back was a stranger, but a welcome one. The severe chignon was gone. Her hair now styled in soft, confident waves that framed a face that was no longer placid, but alive with intelligence and intent. The crimson dress hugged her form, a stark contrast to the muted greys and navies that had become her uniform. This was not the woman Alistair expected to walk into his party. This was not the asset he had instructed to wear sapphires. Her phone buzzed. It was a secure message from Mr. Peterson. "The market is closed. All is quiet. The stage is yours, Mrs. Hawthorne. Or should I say, Ms. Beaumont." She smiled. The name felt right. Madeline Beaumont was back. The driver Alistair had sent was waiting downstairs. As she descended in the private elevator, the mirrored walls reflected a queen in red. The nervousness she had expected to feel was absent, replaced by a full, thrilling certainty. Alistair had told her not to be late, but Madeline had no intention of arriving on his schedule. A queen is never late. Everyone else is simply early. She instructed the driver to take a scenic route along the river, a deliberate delay. Her entrance had to be perfectly timed. She wouldn't arrive in Alistair's shadow. She would arrive when the party was in full swing, when all eyes were on her husband, the master of the universe. Only then would she walk in and steal the show. The grand ballroom of the Metropole Hotel was a universe of power and wealth. Crystal chandeliers dripped light onto a sea of black tuxedos and designer gowns. The air hummed with the discreet murmur of billion-dollar deals and influential gossip. At the center of this universe stood Alistair Hawthorne, radiating success. He was holding court near the grand staircase, a glass of champagne in one hand, Bianca Valenti, clad in a glittering silver dress, artfully positioned at his side. He had just glanced at his watch for the third time, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. Madeline was late. It was unprofessional. He needed her here, playing her part. And then a hush fell over the entrance of the ballroom. It started as a ripple, a few heads turning, and quickly grew into a wave of stunned silence that washed across the entire room. The conversations faltered. The music seemed to fade into the background. Standing at the top of the grand staircase, bathed in the warm glow of the spotlights, was a woman in a breathtaking crimson gown. For a moment, no one recognized her. This woman was a vision of power and confidence. Her head was held high, her gaze sweeping across the room with an unnerving self-possession. The serpent necklace at her throat caught the light, its emerald eyes seeming to glitter with a life of their own. It was Madeline. Alistair froze the champagne glass, momentarily forgotten in his hand. He stared, his mind struggling to reconcile the demure, quiet woman he had left at home with the spectacular creature commanding the attention of every person in the room. It was as if she had been recast in a different role without his permission. The dress, the hair, the look in her eyes, it was all wrong. It was all a defiant, glorious rebellion. Bianca's perfectly curated smile tightened her eyes, narrowing with instant venomous jealousy. This was not the woman she had so easily dismissed for years. This was a rival. As Madeline descended the staircase, the silence broke into a flurry of whispers. "Is that Madeline Hawthorne? I've never seen her look like that. My God, what is she wearing?" The whispers were not of mockery, but of awe and confusion. She moved not with the timid deference Alistair expected, but with a fluid, deliberate grace. She didn't make her way toward her husband. Instead, she veered to the side, where a small group of the most powerful people in the room were gathered. Robert Vance, the industrialist Alistair had been so keen to impress, a tech mogul named Kenji Tanaka, and the formidable head of the National Banking Commission. Alistair watched his confusion turning to anger as they greeted her not with the polite condescension usually reserved for corporate wives, but with genuine warmth and respect. Tanaka leaned in to kiss her cheek. Vance, the man before whom Alistair had humiliated her, actually bowed his head slightly. "Madeline, you look magnificent," Vance said, his voice booming with admiration. "Aris Thorne speaks very highly of you." Madeline gave him a radiant smile. "Aris is a visionary. It's a privilege to be his partner." The words, spoken just loudly enough to be overheard by those nearby, sent another shockwave through the crowd. Partner Alistair started to move toward her, his face a thunderous mask, but he was intercepted by a senator. He was trapped, forced to smile and shake hands while watching his wife, his quiet, decorative wife, hold court with the very people he spent his life trying to impress. She was talking business. She was laughing. She looked more alive than he had ever seen her. Madeline could feel Alistair's gaze burning into her back, but she ignored it. For the first time, she was not an extension of him. She was the center of her own gravity, and she was pulling the most important people in the room into her orbit. She was no longer a ghost in his machine. She had become a machine of her own. Finally, she turned, and her eyes met Alistair's across the crowded room. She held his gaze, and for the first time there was no fear, no deference, no quiet apology in her eyes. There was only the cool, calm assessment of an equal, or perhaps a superior. She gave him a small, enigmatic smile that didn't reach her eyes. A smile that said, "You have no idea what's coming." Then she turned back to her conversation, dismissing him as easily as he had dismissed her for 5 years. The grand entrance was over. It had been a stunning success, but it was only the overture. The main performance was yet to come. The highlight of the Hawthorne Foundation Gala was the live auction, a spectacle of performative philanthropy, where Alistair would take the stage to rally donations and, more importantly, cement his status as the industry's benevolent king. Tonight he took the microphone with an extra dose of swagger, a desperate attempt to reclaim the spotlight his wife had so unexpectedly stolen. He was charming, witty, and powerful. He spoke of legacy, of ambition, of the future his company was building. He was in his element, the master of his universe, and the room was once again under his spell. Madeline watched from a table near the front, her expression perfectly composed. She sat not with the other corporate wives, but between Kenji Tanaka and Robert Vance, a clear statement of her new allegiance. And now Alistair announced, his voice booming, "We come to our final, most exciting announcement of the evening. As many of you know, Hawthorne Industries is dedicated to progress, and as part of that commitment, we are in the final stages of acquiring Helios Innovations, a company with remarkable potential that we intend to fully integrate into our tech division to create unparalleled synergy." A polite, knowing applause rippled through the room. It was the public declaration of his victory. He was putting a flag in the ground. He looked directly at Madeline, a triumphant, challenging glint in his eye, as if to say, "This is my world. This is real power." He then motioned to the gala's host, a well-known journalist. "And to speak more on the future of innovation, I'd like to invite our host back to the stage." The journalist smiled warmly. "Thank you, Alistair. Truly a remarkable vision." He paused, looking down at a card in his hand, with a slightly puzzled expression. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have just been handed an update that appears to be a significant development in that very story. It seems there is another major player in the Helios Innovations deal." A confused murmur spread through the ballroom. Alistair's confident smile faltered. This was not on the program. The host continued, "Helios's board of directors has just released an official statement, effective immediately. They have accepted a partnership and funding agreement from a private investment group that has, over the last 6 months, quietly acquired a 52% controlling stake in the company." The air was sucked out of the room. A controlling stake, that was impossible. Alistair's team had been monitoring every major transaction. This investment, the host read. His voice, filled with drama, will ensure Helios remains an independent entity dedicated to its core mission of sustainable energy. The hostile takeover bid from Hawthorne Industries has been officially rejected. Alistair turned pale. His face, broadcast on the giant screens on either side of the stage, was a mask of disbelief and fury. He had been publicly humiliatingly outmaneuvered. The statement concludes, the host said, looking up at the stunned crowd, by announcing that the new majority shareholder will be taking a public role as the strategic director of the board. The name of the investment group is the Orion Investment Group. He paused for effect. And its principal owner and director is here with us tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ms. Madeline Beaumont. Checkmate. For a moment there was absolute deafening silence. The collective gasp was felt rather than heard. Alistair looked as if he had been struck by lightning, his eyes locking on his wife. Madeline Beaumont. Not Hawthorne. Beaumont. With unhurried grace, Madeline stood up. The crimson of her dress seemed to burn in the spotlights. She gave a small, polite nod to Tanaka and Vance and walked toward the stage. Her heels clicked on the polished floor, each step a hammer blow to Alistair's ego. She took the microphone from the stunned host. She looked out at the sea of shocked faces, her gaze calm and commanding. And then she looked directly at her husband, who was still standing frozen on the stage just a few feet away. "Thank you," she said, her voice clear and steady, amplified throughout the silent hall. "I have always believed that true progress is not about consumption, but about creation. It's not about acquiring and dismantling, but about building and nurturing. Helios Innovations represents a future, I believe, in a legacy of sustainable technology that my late father, a brilliant engineer himself, would have been proud of. My investment group and I are committed to providing Dr. Thorne and his team with everything they need to change the world." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Every word was delivered with the precise, devastating force of a wrecking ball. She had not only beaten him, but she had also claimed the moral high ground, tying her victory to her family's legacy and a noble cause. She had exposed his predatory tactics as a thing of the past. "Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate the future," she concluded. She gave a final dazzling smile to the audience, turned, and walked off the stage, leaving her husband standing alone in the ruins of his triumph, utterly and completely defeated in front of everyone he had ever wanted to impress. The ride back to the penthouse was a study in suffocating silence. Alistair sat rigid on one side of the limousine, his face a granite mask of fury. Madeline sat opposite him, serene and composed, watching the city lights blur past as if it were just another evening. The air between them was thick with unspoken accusations and shattered pride. The moment the penthouse door closed behind them, the fragile truce of silence shattered. "What have you done?" Alistair's voice was a low, dangerous snarl. He tore off his bow tie, his movements jerky with rage. "What in God's name was that?" Madeline calmly slipped off her heels, placing them neatly by the door. She turned to face him, her expression unyielding. "I believe the announcement was quite clear. I saved a company from a predator." "Saved it," he roared, taking a step toward her. "You humiliated me. You went behind my back, conspired against me, and made me a laughingstock in my own ballroom, on my own stage." "Your stage," Madeline countered, her voice dangerously soft. "Was that the same stage where you planned to announce the destruction of a company my father believed in? Or was it the one you shared with your mistress, while your wife was expected to applaud from the audience? You seem to be confused about who owns what, Alistair." The mention of Bianca and her father struck him silent for a second, his rage momentarily short-circuited by the directness of her attack. He had never heard her speak this way. The deference was gone, replaced by a blade of cold steel. "Where did you get the money?" he demanded, his mind racing, trying to piece together the impossible. "I control our finances. You couldn't buy a new car without me knowing about it." "That's where you're wrong," she said, walking toward the windows overlooking the city. "You controlled your finances. You never once bothered to ask about mine. You saw a schoolteacher's daughter and assumed she came with nothing. You never thought to look deeper." She told him then about her grandmother's inheritance, the secret portfolio that had been growing in silence for years. She explained how every time he had dismissed her, ignored her, or humiliated her, it had fueled her resolve. "You saw a hobbyist," she said, her voice laced with the ice of 5 years of repressed anger. "You saw a decorative, quaint little wife. You never ever saw me. You were so blinded by your own arrogance, you couldn't see the person sleeping next to you. That was your biggest mistake." Alistair stared at her. the pieces finally clicking into place. The late nights she was reading the art catalogues that were delivered her sudden interest in the financial news. It had all been happening right under his nose. The sheer scale of her deception, her strategic brilliance, was both terrifying and, on some deep, unrecognized level, astounding. His fury began to curdle into a different, more complex emotion, a grudging, horrified respect. He had been beaten not by a corporate rival, but by his wife, the woman he thought he owned. So this was all for revenge? He asked, his voice quieter now. To destroy me for sleeping with Bianca Madeline let out a short, sharp laugh, devoid of any humor. Oh, Alistair, you still think the world revolves around you. Bianca was a symptom, not the disease. Your affairs were just another example of your profound disrespect. This wasn't about revenge. Revenge is a fleeting emotional act. This was a strategic realignment. You were a bad investment, so I divested. She turned to face him fully, her eyes clear and resolute. I have no interest in destroying you, but I will not stand by and watch you destroy good people and good ideas for profit. Helios Innovations is now under my protection. You will not touch it. You will issue a public statement tomorrow morning withdrawing your bid and wishing the new leadership well. It wasn't a request. It was an order. The power dynamic in the room, in their entire world, had irrevocably shifted. He was a billionaire, a titan, but she held a controlling interest in the one thing he wanted most, and she had just proven she was a far more cunning player than he was. And us, he finally asked the word, hanging awkwardly in the air. What about us? Madeline looked at him, and for the first time he saw a flicker of the woman he had married, a deep sadness in her eyes. There is no us, Alistair. There hasn't been for a very long time. You just built such a large, gilded cage that it took me a while to find the door. She walked past him, heading toward the guest wing of the penthouse. I'll have my things moved out by the end of the week. My lawyers will be in touch with yours. I suggest you tell them to be cooperative. He was left standing alone in the vast, silent living room, surrounded by the cold, minimalist art that was supposed to represent his success. For the first time, he understood the true meaning of the word bankrupt. He hadn't just lost a deal. He had lost the one person who had been holding his world together in a way he had been too blind to ever appreciate. The ghost in his machine had become the master of it, and she had just turned it off. The days that followed the gala were a brutal education for Alistair Hawthorne. The story of his public defeat was the lead item in every financial journal and gossip column. The narrative was intoxicating: the invisible wife, the secret heiress, the brilliant corporate maneuver. Madeline Beaumont was instantly mythologized as a feminist icon, a strategic genius who had emerged from the shadows. Alistair, conversely, was painted as an arrogant fool, outsmarted by the one person he should have known best. His investors were spooked. His board of directors demanded emergency meetings. The illusion of his invincibility, the very foundation of his power, was shattered. Calls were not being returned. Deals that had been all but certain were suddenly put on hold. The world that had once bent to his will now viewed him with a new critical eye. Bianca Valenti was one of the first rats to leave the sinking ship. She saw that Alistair's social and professional currency had plummeted. Within a week, she had quietly resigned from Hawthorne Industries, releasing a statement about pursuing new opportunities. There was no loyalty in her world, only a ruthless calculation of power, and Alistair was no longer the winning bet. Her departure was a footnote in his cascade of losses, but it was a telling one. True to her word, Madeline moved out of the penthouse. She didn't flee in the night. She arranged for professional movers to come during broad daylight, a calm, orderly, and very public dismantling of their life together. She took only her personal belongings, her books, and a single painting from the collection, not one of the famous expensive ones, but a small, serene landscape she had always loved, one Alistair had deemed insignificant. Alistair, meanwhile, found himself adrift in the echoing silence of the massive apartment. Every room was a monument to his failure. He would catch himself listening for her soft footsteps, for the gentle sound of her turning a page in her study. The silence he had once cultivated as a sign of his dominance now felt like a crushing, unbearable void. Stripped of the sycophants and the distractions, he was forced to confront the truth. He replayed the last 5 years in his mind, but this time he saw it through her eyes. He saw her attempts to connect her intelligent suggestions. He'd brushed aside her quiet dignity in the face of his blatant affairs, her profound loneliness. He had mistaken her grace for weakness, her silence for submission. He had not just ignored her. He had actively tried to diminish her to keep her small, so he could feel large. 2 weeks after the gala, humbled and desperate, he did something he hadn't done in years. He asked to see her, not through lawyers, but directly. He sent her a simple handwritten note. They met in a neutral location, a private room at the gallery where she had once worked. When she walked in, he was struck once again by her transformation. She was wearing a simple but impeccably tailored business dress. The quiet uncertainty was gone, replaced by an aura of calm authority. She was no longer Mrs. Hawthorne, the appendage. She was Madeline Beaumont, the principal. "Thank you for meeting me," he began, his voice strained. "Madeline, I am sorry." The apology hung in the air. It was genuine, born of a painful and profound self-realization. "I was a fool," he continued. "I was arrogant and cruel, and I didn't deserve you. I took your light and tried to hide it, because I was afraid it would outshine my own. I see that. Now." Madeline listened, her expression unreadable. She did not offer him the easy comfort of immediate forgiveness. "What do you want, Alistair?" she asked, her tone not unkind, but direct. "I want—" He hesitated. The honest answer was that he wanted her back. He wanted the life he had so carelessly thrown away. But he knew that was impossible. He had broken that beyond repair. So he offered the only thing he had left. "I want to propose a partnership." She raised an eyebrow. "Not a personal one," he clarified quickly. "A professional one. You were right about Helios. My approach was wrong. Your vision is better. You are a better strategist than I am. Hawthorne. Industries is taking a beating. We need a new direction, a new story. A joint venture between Hawthorne and a revitalized Helios. It would be powerful. We could do great things. Together." It was the ultimate concession. He was admitting her superiority and begging for a professional lifeline. He was offering to be her partner on her terms. Madeline considered his proposal for a long moment. The old Madeline would have shrunk from the idea. But she was no longer that woman. She saw the opportunity not to save him, but to leverage his resources for her own goals. With the power of Hawthorne Industries behind Helios, the impact they could make would be magnified tenfold. "I will consider it," she said finally. "I will have my team draw up a preliminary proposal. But Madeline, be very clear on this. I will be the senior partner. The terms will be mine, and my lawyers will oversee every detail. There will be no room for the old ways." Alistair nodded a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled him. It was more than he deserved. Whatever you say, the terms will be yours. He left the gallery that day, a different man, humbled, defeated, but with a flicker of hope. Not for a romantic reconciliation, but for a chance to build something new from the ashes of his arrogance, guided by the woman he had so foolishly underestimated. Madeline watched him go, feeling not triumph, but a quiet sense of closure. Her journey hadn't been about destroying him. It had been about finding herself. She had stepped out of his shadow, not just to be seen, but to finally cast a shadow of her own, one that was long powerful and shaped entirely by her own design. That night at the gala was not an ending, but a spectacular beginning. Madeline Beaumont's story became a legend in the business world, a testament to the quiet power that is so often overlooked. She didn't just win a battle against her husband. She redefined her entire existence, transforming from a silent partner in a lonely marriage to a visionary leader in a competitive industry. Her journey teaches us that true strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's forged in silence, built in the shadows of neglect, waiting for the perfect moment to step into the light and change the world. She proved that the most valuable asset is not wealth or power, but a sense of self-worth that no one can take from you. What did you think of Madeline's incredible transformation? Have you ever felt underestimated, only to prove everyone wrong? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. We love hearing from you. If you were captivated by this story of empowerment and sweet revenge, please give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable stories. Click that notification bell so you never miss an update. Thank you for watching. The ballroom of the Carlisle estate shimmered with 1,000,000 stars, each one a diamond catching the light, an echo of the billion-dollar empire built by Ethan Carlisle. He stood at the center of it all, a man who had everything, including a wife who was little more than a beautiful accessory. Tonight, on their 10th anniversary, he planned to make it official, to finally and publicly expose the secret he believed made her unworthy of his name. But he failed to account for a single, unassuming figure who would walk through the gilded doors, a man whose arrival would not only shatter Ethan's carefully constructed world, but reveal a truth so profound it would make his entire fortune look like a child's allowance. This isn't a fairy tale. It's a cold, hard lesson in what it means to be truly wealthy. The air inside the Carlisle Hall was thick with the scent of white roses and old money. Chandeliers, each a cascade of crystal and light, hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a brilliant glow on the hundreds of guests who moved through the vast space with practiced ease. This was more than a party. It was a testament to the power and prestige of Ethan Carlisle. At 45, he was a titan of finance, a self-made man who had turned a small investment firm into a global powerhouse. His success was his identity, and he wore it like a tailored suit, perfectly arrogantly, and without a single wrinkle. He stood by the marble bar, a flute of champagne in his hand, his gaze sweeping the room. He nodded to Vincent Caldwell, a senior partner in his firm, and exchanged a few clipped words with Bridget Montgomery, a well-known socialite whose gossip column was the lifeblood of their circle. Ethan's smile was a professional tool, a flash of teeth that promised affability, but revealed nothing of the cold calculus that governed his mind. Tonight it was all for show. The grand stage was set for their 10th wedding anniversary, and in his mind it was the final act of a performance he had grown to despise. His wife Genevieve was the main attraction tonight, and Ethan felt a familiar surge of resentment as he watched her. She was a vision in a midnight blue silk gown, simple yet elegant, its clean lines belying the immense cost. Her dark hair was swept up, revealing the graceful curve of her neck, and a single string of pearls, a gift from him, sat at her throat. Genevieve moved through the crowd with a quiet grace, her laughter a soft, melodious sound that seemed almost out of place amidst the sharp, brittle chatter of the elite. She spoke to everyone with the same genuine warmth, from the powerful CEO of a tech giant to the young caterer who had just started her job. Ethan's lips thinned. That was the problem with Genevieve. She was an anomaly. She didn't fit. He had met her a decade ago, a beautiful, unassuming young woman working at a small, independent art gallery. He had been enchanted by her sincerity, her lack of pretense, a refreshing contrast to the women who swarmed him. He had convinced himself she was different, that her simple nature was a blank canvas he could mold into the perfect society wife. He had proposed after only 3 months, a whirlwind romance that had left his friends and family reeling. But the years had passed, and the enchantment had faded, replaced by a deep-seated frustration. He had tried everything. He had bought her designer clothes, hired the best stylists and social coaches, and introduced her to his world. Yet she remained Genevieve. She still spent her afternoons volunteering at a community center for children. She still preferred a quiet evening reading to a raucous gala. She still spoke of her family. Her father, a seemingly unremarkable man named Patrick O'Connor, and her late mother with a reverence that Ethan found baffling and embarrassing. Her humble origins, once a charming novelty, had become a source of profound shame for him. He had built his empire on sharp deals and ruthless efficiency. Every aspect of his life was a testament to his ambition, his vision. But Genevieve was a living, breathing symbol of his one great miscalculation. She was a flaw in his otherwise flawless existence, a reminder of a romantic folly he now deeply regretted. And tonight, he would put an end to it. Vincent Caldwell approached him, a man whose loyalty Ethan had bought and whose opinion he valued. "The party is a roaring success, Ethan, a testament to your impeccable taste." "Thank you, Vincent," Ethan replied, his eyes still fixed on his wife. "It's about to get even more interesting." Vincent followed his gaze to Genevieve, a puzzled expression on his face. "Genevieve looks stunning tonight. She's so genuine, a rare commodity in this crowd." Ethan snorted softly, a sound that was half laugh, half contempt. "Genuine or naive? She's the daughter of a man who lives in a glorified shed in the woods, Vincent. I built this empire with grit and cunning. She comes from a world of sentimentality and hand-me-downs. We are two different species." Vincent's face tightened. "That's a bit harsh, isn't it? She's an incredible woman." "She is a liability," Ethan said, his voice dropping to a low, venomous whisper. "She's a testament to the fact that you can't buy class, and you certainly can't manufacture it. The longer she's by my side, the more people whisper about her simple background, about the charming pauper who married the king. I'm a man who deals in perception, Vincent, and her presence, her ordinariness, is a chink in my armor." He took a long sip of his champagne, the cold liquid doing little to soothe the fire of his frustration. He had put on a good front for a decade, but the charade was wearing thin. He had planned this evening meticulously. The speeches, the toasts, the grand declarations, they were all a prelude to the moment he would finally, publicly, and irreversibly detach himself from the woman who had become a symbol of his greatest failure. Genevieve, unaware of the storm brewing in her husband's mind, was now speaking with Bridget Montgomery. Bridget, with her hawk-like gaze and predatory smile, was a master of a different kind of commerce, the trade of secrets and insecurities. Genevieve was smiling, but Ethan could see the subtle strain around her eyes. He knew Bridget was probably prying, asking about her family, her past, all the things that Ethan had tried to bury. He watched as Genevieve answered with quiet dignity, refusing to be baited. His resentment flared. How could she not understand? How could she still hold on to the relics of a life that he had given her, the chance to escape? He had given her wealth, status, a world she could never have imagined. He had transformed her from a girl in a second-hand dress to the wife of one of the most powerful men in the country, and yet she had refused to let go of her humble roots, treating her past not as something to be escaped, but as a cherished part of who she was. It was a silent act of defiance he could no longer tolerate. The hour was approaching. The orchestra had shifted to a more subdued classical melody. The guests had gathered in the main ballroom, their anticipation palpable. Ethan put down his empty glass. He felt a quiet, simmering resolve. Tonight the whispers would stop. The questions would cease. He would make sure of it. He would expose the truth not just to the world, but to Genevieve herself, a final act of liberation for them both. He would show her that the life he had given her was a gilded cage, and that the key to true freedom was to leave behind the sentimentality of the past and embrace the cold, hard reality of his world. He straightened his tie, a confident, predatory glint in his eyes. The show was about to begin. The crowd settled, a hush falling over the glittering ballroom as Ethan made his way to the podium. Genevieve had been asked to join him, and she stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, a picture of grace and wifely devotion. Ethan felt the warmth of her touch, but it was a heat he had long grown numb to. He looked out at the sea of faces, a mix of business rivals, social peers, and a smattering of curious journalists. He had their attention. "Good evening, everyone," Ethan began, his voice amplified by the microphone, commanding and smooth. "Thank you all for joining us tonight to celebrate a significant milestone, 10 years of marriage. 10 years. He paused, letting the number hang in the air, a testament to his supposed commitment. And what a decade it has been. He turned to Genevieve, and a ripple of sentimental murmurs went through the crowd. Genevieve's smile was genuine, her eyes shining with emotion. She was truly happy, truly in love with the man she believed was her partner. It was this simple, unshakable faith in him that fueled Ethan's contempt. It was a naivete he found pathetic. 10 years ago, he continued, I met a woman who was a complete paradox. She was everything I wasn't, quiet, unassuming, with a complete lack of ambition. She worked in an art gallery, a place where people trade in sentimentality and subjective value. I, as you know, trade in cold, hard numbers and indisputable facts. The crowd chuckled, a few knowing glances exchanged. Genevieve's smile faltered slightly. She squeezed his arm, a gentle, silent plea. Ethan ignored it. This was his stage, and he was the star. I saw her as a project. I thought I could introduce her to my world, that I could give her the life she never knew she wanted. I brought her out of the quiet, unremarkable town she came from, and into this world of prestige and power. His voice dripped with condescension. I gave her a name, a home, a wardrobe full of clothes that cost more than her father's entire year's salary. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder this time, with a note of unease. Genevieve's hand had dropped from his arm. Her face, which had been so full of light moments before, was now pale, her eyes wide with shock and a dawning horror. I tried to make her into a society woman. He continued, his tone turning openly mocking. I hired the best tutors to teach her table manners, to help her select wine, to learn the difference between a Monet and a Manet. She tried, bless her heart. She truly did. He let out a harsh, humorless laugh. But some things are just ingrained, aren't they? You can take the girl out of the country, but you can't take the country out of the girl. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Bridget Montgomery leaned over to her friend, her eyes gleaming with vindictive delight. Vincent Caldwell's face was a mask of shock and disgust. He had known Ethan was a man of little sentiment, but this was beyond the pale. I have spent a decade building a life for us, a life of unparalleled luxury and influence, Ethan said, his voice rising in volume and arrogance. But you see, while I was building empires, Genevieve was, well, she was still dreaming of her father's little farm. She still talks about her mother's vegetable garden and the simple joys of a life I worked so hard to escape. And tonight, I have to be honest with myself and with all of you. My beautiful wife is an artifact from a past I've long outgrown. She is the living, breathing reminder of a sentimental mistake I made 10 years ago. Tears had welled in Genevieve's eyes, but she held them back with an almost superhuman effort. Her jaw was clenched, and she stood straight, a warrior facing an impossible foe. The silence that followed Ethan's words was deafening, a vacuum created by 100+ people holding their breath. Ethan looked at her, expecting to see a broken woman. Instead, he saw a glimmer of steel in her tear-filled eyes. So to my beautiful, my wonderfully simple wife, he said, holding up his glass in a mockery of a toast. Thank you for the 10 years. You have taught me a very valuable lesson that there are some things, some people that no amount of money can ever truly change. He drank from the glass, his eyes fixed on her. The public shaming was complete. The crowd was a blur of horrified, pitying, and even gloating expressions. He had done it. He had freed himself. He was ready to announce their separation, to issue a cold, professional statement that their 10-year experiment had come to an end. Genevieve took a deep, shuddering breath. The spotlight was on her, a harsh, unforgiving glare. The world was watching her crumble. Her humiliation was complete. But just as she was about to turn and walk away, to find a dark corner to hide in, a new voice cut through the stunned silence. It wasn't loud, but it had an authority that commanded attention, a quiet resonance that made Ethan's brash pronouncements seem like the bluster of a child. I believe I must apologize for my tardiness, the voice said, and every head in the room turned toward the entrance of the ballroom. A man stood there completely out of place amidst the black tie finery. He wore a simple, well-worn tweed jacket and a pair of trousers that looked a decade old. His face was a map of lines and character, his grey hair a bit disheveled. He was of average height and build, his hands calloused. He looked like a man who worked with his hands, a man from a world utterly alien to the one they inhabited. It was Genevieve's father, Patrick O'Connor. A wave of mortification washed over Ethan. This was the final ironic nail in the coffin of his perfect evening. The very man he had just publicly mocked had arrived, a physical manifestation of everything he had just disparaged. He was the rustic farmer, the simple country bumpkin, the walking embodiment of Genevieve's humble, embarrassing past. Patrick O'Connor walked slowly, deliberately into the center of the room, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on his daughter. A soft, pained expression crossed his face as he saw her tear-streaked cheeks. Then his gaze shifted, and it landed on Ethan. And in his eyes there was no anger, no rage, only a deep, profound sense of disappointment. A disappointment that cut Ethan to the bone more effectively than any insult could have. The game had just changed. The grand ballroom moments before a stage for a public spectacle now felt like a holding cell for 100+ stunned onlookers. The air once filled with the cloying scent of roses was now heavy with an unspoken question. Who was this man? And why had he appeared at the exact moment of peak drama? Patrick O'Connor continued his slow, measured walk toward the podium. He didn't rush. He didn't make a scene. His presence was a quiet, steady force, a complete contrast to the manic energy Ethan had just radiated. He moved past the hushed and confused guests, his gaze fixed on Genevieve. He took her hand in his, a large, strong hand, with a few scars and calluses that spoke of a life lived with purpose. Genevieve, her face a mixture of shock and relief, clung to him, her composure finally beginning to crack. "Genevieve, my dear," Patrick said, his voice a gentle, low rumble. "I am so sorry I'm late. I got the time zone wrong. The plane landed, and I had to take a taxi to the estate. My apologies to you and your husband for the interruption." He spoke with a quiet politeness that was almost more towering than if he had yelled. Ethan, still standing at the podium, felt a cold sweat form on his brow. The man's simple, direct manner was unnerving. He looked completely unfazed by the opulence, by the hundreds of eyes on him. He wasn't intimidated. He was just there. And his very presence invalidated everything Ethan had just said. "This is a private event." Ethan snapped, his voice tight with humiliation. "I don't know who you are, but you have no business interrupting a private family matter." Genevieve turned to her husband, her eyes wide. "Ethan, this is my father, Patrick. I told you he was coming." Ethan's mind raced. He had dismissed Genevieve's mention of her father's visit. He had assumed Patrick O'Connor was a man who lived a quiet life, a man who wouldn't dare step foot into his son-in-law's world of wealth and prestige. But here he was, and in a single moment he had dismantled Ethan's carefully constructed narrative. Patrick turned his attention to Ethan. He looked him up and down, a calm, assessing gaze that made Ethan feel like a bug under a microscope. "Patrick O'Connor," he said, extending his hand, "and I believe you just publicly humiliated my daughter, a beautiful girl who, I might add, deserves nothing but love and respect." Ethan, too, stunned to refuse, shook the man's hand. The grip was firm and honest. "I was simply stating the truth," he retorted, trying to regain his footing. "Your daughter is a lovely woman, but we come from two very different worlds. She is not built for this life." Patrick let out a soft, almost pitying chuckle. He looked around the ballroom, taking in the chandeliers, the marble floors, the perfectly dressed guests. "This life?" he said, his voice laced with an irony that was completely lost on Ethan. "A life of fancy parties and speeches full of thinly veiled contempt. That's not a life, son. That's a stage, and a very poorly managed one at that." The whispers in the crowd had ceased. Everyone was hanging on Patrick's every word. Vincent Caldwell looked on with a strange mix of recognition and curiosity. Bridget Montgomery had put away her pen and notepad, her usual predatory smile replaced by an expression of genuine confusion. "I apologize again for interrupting your little performance," Patrick continued, his voice still low and even. "But when a man stands up and talks about my daughter as if she were a piece of property, a project to be molded, I believe I have the right to interject." Ethan's face was a mask of furious red. "You have no right here. Who do you think you are?" "Patrick." O'Connor's lips curved into a slow, knowing smile. He patted Genevieve's hand and looked out at the assembled guests. "It's a fair question," he said. "Who do I think I am? For the past 10 years, I've been content to be known as Genevieve's father. But perhaps for clarity's sake, it's time to be a little more specific." He turned back to Ethan. "I believe you're a man who deals in numbers, son. Cold, hard facts. Well, let me give you a few." He reached into the inner pocket of his worn tweed jacket and pulled out a small, unassuming black leather folder. He didn't open it. He simply held it in his hand, a silent but powerful prop. "You mentioned my daughter's humble beginnings." Patrick said, his voice still quiet, but now with an undeniable edge. "You said I live in a glorified shed. You're not wrong. I do live in a cabin on a very large piece of land. But I own the land, not just the 50 acres where the cabin sits, but thousands of acres around it. Land I bought with the money from a patent I sold a long, long time ago. A patent for a certain type of high-efficiency engine that powers a very popular line of luxury sports cars." A wave of speculation went through the crowd. Vincent Caldwell's eyes widened. He knew of that patent. It had been the cornerstone of a massive automotive empire, a secret that had made its anonymous inventor a fortune in the late 90s. But no one had ever known who the man was. "That's a nice little story," Ethan sneered, though the confidence in his voice was beginning to waver. "But it doesn't change anything. You're still just a man in an old jacket." Patrick let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Just a man? Son, you have no idea. The patent was a good start. But you know what a man does with a good start. He invests, quietly, discreetly. I bought up land, sure, but I also invested in a little-known tech company back in the early 2000s. A company whose software now runs the entire logistics chain for, I don't know, a certain global shipping giant. A company that you, Mr. Carlyle, have been trying to acquire for the last 2 years, only to have your bids mysteriously rebuffed." Ethan felt the floor tilt beneath his feet. He had spent months trying to acquire that logistics company, an elusive target with a single anonymous majority shareholder who refused to sell. He had even sent his top negotiators to track down the man, but they had always returned empty-handed. "Could it be? And then there's the art gallery," Patrick said, turning his gaze to the crowd. "You said my daughter worked at a simple art gallery. You are correct. It was simple. It was also the first and only gallery to showcase the works of a certain reclusive artist who goes by the name P. O'Connor." Another wave of whispers. Bridget Montgomery gasped aloud. The name was synonymous with modern art genius. P. O'Connor paintings known for their raw emotional power and anonymous origin sold for millions at auction. No one had ever seen the man, but everyone knew his work. Patrick finally opened the folder. He pulled out a single sheet of paper and handed it to Ethan. It was a certified bank statement, not just a statement but a balance sheet of a holding company. Ethan's eyes scanned the numbers, and the world seemed to stop. The number at the bottom was not in the millions. It was in the tens of billions. The paper crinkled in his hand. He looked at the name on the account, O'Connor Holdings. Patrick. O'Connor took the paper back, folded it neatly, and slipped it back into his pocket. He turned to Genevieve and took her hand again, his voice now gentle and full of love. My daughter's humble beginnings, as you so arrogantly put it, were not born of necessity but of choice. I raised her to know the value of an honest day's work, to understand that true wealth is not measured in dollars, but in character. I have always taught her that a good heart is worth more than $1 billion empire. And she, unlike you, never forgot that lesson. The crowd stared in disbelief. Vincent Caldwell's jaw was on the floor. Bridget Montgomery looked like she had seen a ghost. Ethan Carlyle, the self-made billionaire, was now just a man standing on a stage, his carefully constructed facade of success and power completely and utterly shattered by a man in an old tweed jacket. The humiliation was no longer his to inflict. It was his to bear. And the night was only just getting started. The silence in the ballroom was profound, a physical weight pressing down on every single person. The information Patrick had just dropped was a bombshell that had not only detonated Ethan's carefully planned evening, but had also rewritten the entire social hierarchy of their world. For a decade, Ethan Carlyle had been the undisputed king, a man who had pulled himself up by his bootstraps and built an empire from scratch. Now it seemed his empire wasn't his at all, but a castle built on sand. Ethan's mind was in a state of chaotic disbelief. He looked at Patrick, then at Genevieve, then back at Patrick as if trying to reconcile the simple man standing before him with the multi-billionaire he had just described. The numbers on that bank statement, the companies Patrick had mentioned, it was all real. He had spent countless hours and millions of dollars trying to acquire that elusive logistics firm, a key component to his grand expansion plan. And the anonymous owner, the man he had never been able to find, was his father-in-law. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. You are P. O'Connor. Ethan finally managed to stammer his voice, a pathetic croak. Patrick smiled. It was a genuine, warm smile, full of a kind of wisdom that Ethan could only pretend to possess. Among other things, he said, the art was a hobby. I never cared for the attention. That's why I chose to be anonymous. And the engine patent, well, I was just a young man with an idea. The money was a happy coincidence. He turned to Genevieve, who was still holding his hand. Her face a mix of emotions, relief, sorrow, and a quiet, weary resolve. I gave Genevieve the option, Patrick said, addressing the stunned crowd, his voice still calm and steady. I could have given her the world. A trust fund, a foundation in her name, a life of effortless luxury. But she chose a different path. She chose to live simply, to work for a cause she believed in, to find her own way in the world. She chose to be a woman of substance, not a woman of spectacle. Ethan felt a suffocating sense of shame. He had been so blind, so consumed by his own arrogance and his obsession with appearances, that he had completely misjudged the woman he had been married to for 10 years. He had seen her lack of ambition as a flaw, her simplicity as a sign of her low status. He had never once considered that it was a choice, a deliberate act of character. "And you, Mr. Carlyle," Patrick said, turning his gaze back to Ethan, the warmth in his voice evaporating, replaced by a cold razor-sharp edge. "You were meant to be the test. You were a man of the world, a man of power. I thought perhaps he will see her for who she truly is. He will love her for her kindness, her grace, her spirit. Not for what she can be made into, but for what she already is. He shook his head slowly, a profound disappointment etched on his face. You failed that test, son. You failed spectacularly. The crowd began to buzz the whispers, now a frantic, excited chatter. Vincent Caldwell pushed his way to the front, his face pale. "Mr. O'Connor," he said, his voice a reverent whisper. "My firm has been trying to get in touch with you for months. The logistics company. We had no idea." Patrick nodded. "I'm sure you didn't. I prefer to keep a low profile. I don't need a publicist to tell people who I am. My assets speak for themselves, unlike some." He glanced at Ethan, a flash of pure contempt in his eyes. Now Patrick's gaze was directed solely at Ethan. "You see, son," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate tone that nonetheless carried through the silent hall. "You've always believed you are a self-made man, that every dollar you have is a testament to your own genius. But that's where you're wrong." Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs. He felt a deep, primal fear, a fear that he had never known before. What else was there? What else could this man possibly take from him? "Do you know where the original funding for your family's first venture came from, Ethan?" Patrick asked a rhetorical question. "The small loan that saved your father's business from bankruptcy all those years ago. That was a quiet investment I made, an investment in a small company with a promising if unproven model. I did it because your father, God rest his soul, was a good and honest man, a man who always spoke with great pride of his son's ambition." Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. It was impossible. His father had always told him the loan came from a private anonymous benefactor who had been impressed by their business plan. It was the founding myth of the Carlyle Empire, a story of a small, honest business saved by a miracle. And that miracle, it turned out, was his wife's father. And do you know why your company's stock has never crashed, even through 2 major market downturns? Patrick continued, his voice relentless. "Because I've been a quiet, discreet majority shareholder in your firm, for years propping up your stock prices, making sure your empire never crumbled. I did it for Genevieve's sake. I wanted to protect her and her future, just in case you in your arrogance ran your company into the ground." The final blow. Ethan's legs felt weak. His entire life, his entire fortune, his entire identity as a self-made man was a lie. He was not a titan of industry. He was a protégé, a puppet on a string, a man whose success had been quietly and secretly engineered by the very man he had just publicly humiliated. Genevieve, her hand still in her father's, looked at her husband with a mixture of pity and sorrow. She had always known. She had known that her father, a man of quiet substance, had been the silent force behind Ethan's public spectacle. She had watched for a decade as Ethan had mocked her for her roots, all while being completely dependent on those very same roots for his success. Patrick O'Connor looked around the room, his gaze sweeping over the horrified, stunned faces of the elite. "Now," he said, his voice ringing with a newfound authority, "who's the simple one? The one who lives by his word and his deeds, or the one who built a house of cards and had the audacity to call it a mansion?" He took Genevieve's arm and gently led her away from the podium, leaving Ethan standing alone in the center of his own wreckage. The crowd parted for them, their whispers now reverent, not pitying. Ethan watched them go, his chest heaving, his mind in a state of utter overwhelming shock. He had started the night as the king of his universe. He was now in front of everyone who mattered a fraud, and the true architect of his life's work was the man he had just tried to shame. The gala dissolved into a maelstrom of confusion and frantic whispers. Guests began to leave in a hurry, their faces a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and a certain ghoulish fascination. The air, once filled with the celebratory clinking of glasses, now hummed with the electric current of scandal. Vincent Caldwell, looking like he had just witnessed a ghost, approached Ethan, but Ethan waved him away. His mind was a white-hot furnace of denial and panic. He had to get out of there. He had to be alone. He walked off the stage, his steps unsteady, his carefully maintained composure gone. He moved through the thinning crowd like a phantom, oblivious to the stares, the pitying looks, the hushed conversations. He didn't stop until he reached his private study, a room he had always considered his sanctuary. He slammed the heavy oak door shut and locked it, plunging the room into a deep, disquieting silence. He stared at the objects in the room, symbols of his success. The signed first edition of a financial treatise, the model of a yacht. He was building a photograph of him on the cover of a magazine, a title blaring Ethan Carlyle, The Midas Touch. He had always believed in the truth of that title. He had always believed he could turn anything he touched into gold. But tonight, that belief had been brutally, publicly, and irrevocably shattered. The Midas touch wasn't his. It was Patrick's. All of it. The original seed money, the quiet protection of his stock, the unobtainable logistics company that would have been the jewel in his crown. It was all under the control of the man he had dismissed as a simple country farmer. The irony was a poison in his veins. He had shamed his wife for her humble background, never realizing that her roots were not a source of poverty, but a fountain of unimaginable wealth and quiet power. He had been a fool, an arrogant, short-sighted, and pathetic fool. A knock on the door jolted him. "Ethan, it's me. Vincent." Ethan ignored him. He didn't want to see anyone. He wanted to disappear. He walked to the window and stared out at the sprawling, perfectly manicured grounds. All of it was a lie. His success was an illusion, a magnificent facade built on a foundation he had never even known existed. Another more insistent knock. "Ethan, it's Genevieve. Please open the door. We need to talk." Genevieve. The woman he had just eviscerated in front of everyone. The woman who had known the truth all along. A new wave of shame washed over him. He had belittled her, called her simple, and mocked her for being a project. All the while she had been protecting him, living a quiet life that was a testament to her character, not her lack of ambition. The truth was a scalding, bitter pill. He had never been a self-made man. He was a child, propped up and protected by a patriarch he didn't even know existed. He had built his entire identity on a lie. He was a fraud. He heard the lock click and the door swing open. Genevieve and her father stood there. They didn't rush in. They stood in the doorway, their faces a mix of sorrow and resolve. "I need some time to process this," Ethan said, his voice raw. "You don't have time." Patrick said, his voice still that low, measured rumble. "The reporters are already calling. Your board members are calling. Your world is crumbling, son, and it's time to decide what you want to do about it." Genevieve walked into the room, her eyes never leaving his. She was no longer the humiliated wife. She was a woman who had been tested and had passed with flying colors. "Why, Ethan?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with an unwavering clarity. "Why was it so important to you that I be something I'm not? Why couldn't you just accept me?" Was I so terrible? Was my quietness so offensive? He looked at her truly. Looked at her for the first time in years. Her face, her simple dress, her unassuming grace. He had been so blind. I just wanted us to be a perfect match. He said the words a hollow echo of his long-held delusion. I worked so hard for everything. I wanted my wife to be a testament to that success. Genevieve let out a small, mirthless laugh. A testament to your success, Ethan. I was your partner. I was the one who encouraged you to take that risk with the European market. I was the one who went through your reports and found the discrepancy in the shipping manifests. I was the one who convinced you to donate to the children's charity, the one that ended up getting you that Humanitarian of the Year award. Ethan's jaw dropped. She was right. She had been a sounding board, a quiet, intelligent force in his life. He had dismissed her contributions, attributing her insights to luck or coincidence. You never saw me as a person, Genevieve said, her voice full of a sorrow that cut him deeper than any insult. You saw me as a role, the trophy wife, the accessory. My father knew that true wealth isn't in what you own, but in who you are. He gave me the choice to live that truth. I chose to be a woman of substance. You chose to be a man of spectacle. Patrick walked further into the room and closed the door behind him. The truth is, son, he said, his voice now devoid of any pretense. You have a choice. You can let the world find out the full extent of the truth, that your empire is a house of cards, and that you are not the genius you have led everyone to believe you are. Or you can start over. Really start over. Ethan looked at him, his mind reeling. Start over. What do you mean? I'll sell you the logistics company, Patrick said, a glint in his eye. At a fair market price, and I will keep my role as a silent investor in your firm. But there are conditions. Ethan's heart began to beat with a frantic, desperate hope. What conditions? First, you get down on your knees and apologize to my daughter. Sincerely. Not for public show, but from the depths of your soul. You have to earn back her respect, not with money, but with genuine remorse. Ethan looked at Genevieve, his eyes full of a plea for forgiveness. She simply watched him, a silent, unblinking witness to his downfall. Second, Patrick continued, you will work for me, for a year. You will not be Ethan Carlyle, CEO. You will be an associate. You will work on the ground in the field. You will learn what it means to build something with your own two hands, with integrity and hard work. You will learn the difference between a real asset and a paper asset. Ethan's head snapped up. Work for you. You're a farmer and a painter. Patrick let out a genuine, booming laugh. And an engineer, a tech investor, a real estate mogul, and a man who knows the value of an honest dollar. Don't be fooled by the tweed jacket, son. It's a lot warmer than a hollow suit. You will work for me, and you will learn to be a man of substance. And if you pass my test, if you prove that you have a character worth a damn, then we can talk about the future. For you and for my daughter. He looked at Genevieve, a silent question in his eyes. She nodded slowly. This was her decision, her quiet path to redemption for a decade of public ridicule. Ethan looked from Patrick to Genevieve, and for the first time he saw them not as his wife and his father-in-law, but as two powerful, unwavering forces. He saw the truth, the whole unvarnished truth. He could choose to fight, to cling to his broken identity, and watch his empire collapse around him. Or he could choose to humble himself, to start over, and to maybe, just maybe, become the man he had always pretended to be. The decision the most important of his life was now his to make. The gala, a stage for public spectacle, had dissolved into a maelstrom of confusion. Guests fled their faces, a mix of shock and morbid fascination. Ethan walked through the thinning crowd like a phantom, oblivious to the stares, and locked himself in his private study, a sanctuary now filled with hollow symbols of his success. He stared at a magazine cover, bearing his face titled, "Ethan Carlyle, the Midas Touch." The words now mocked him. The Midas touch wasn't his. It was Patrick's, all of it. The original seed money, the quiet protection of his stock, the unobtainable logistics company. His empire was a lie. A knock on the door jolted him. It was Genevieve and her father. He couldn't face them. "I need time to process this," Ethan said, his voice raw. "You don't have time." Patrick's voice was a low, steady rumble. "The reporters are already calling. Your world is crumbling, and it's time to decide what you want to do." Genevieve walked, in her eyes clear and unwavering. "Why, Ethan? Why was it so important that I be something I'm not? Was my quietness so offensive?" He looked up, unable to lie. "I just wanted us to be a perfect match. I worked so hard for everything. I wanted my wife to be a testament to that success." Genevieve let out a small, mirthless laugh. "A testament to your success, Ethan? I was your partner. I was the one who encouraged you to take that risk with the European market. I was the one who found the discrepancy in your shipping reports. You saw me as a role, the trophy wife. But I was never a project. I was a person." The weight of her words was immense. He had dismissed her contributions, attributing her insights to luck. All the while she had been a quiet, intelligent force in his life. He was the coward afraid people would see the cracks in his perfect facade, so he tried to make her a scapegoat for his own insecurities. Patrick stepped in, closing the door behind him. "You have a choice, son. You can let the world find out the full truth that your empire is a house of cards, or you can start over. Really start over." A desperate hope flared in Ethan. "Start over? What do you mean?" "I'll sell you the logistics company at a fair price," Patrick said, "and I will remain a silent investor in your firm. But there are conditions." "What conditions?" "First, you apologize to my daughter, sincerely, not for public show, but from the depths of your soul. You have to earn back her respect." Ethan looked at Genevieve, his eyes filled with a plea for forgiveness. She watched him, a silent, unblinking witness to his downfall. "Second," Patrick continued, "you will work for me. For a year. You will not be Ethan Carlyle, CEO. You will be an associate. You will learn to build something with your own two hands, with integrity and hard work. You will learn the difference between a real asset and a paper asset." Ethan's head snapped up. "Work for you. A farmer and a painter." Patrick laughed, a genuine, booming sound. "And an engineer, a tech investor, a real estate mogul. Don't be fooled by the tweed jacket, son. It's a lot warmer than a hollow suit. You will work for me, and you will learn to be a man of substance. And if you pass my test, we can talk about the future." He looked at Genevieve, and she nodded slowly. This was her decision, her path to redemption, for a decade of ridicule. Ethan looked from Patrick to Genevieve, finally seeing them as two powerful, unwavering forces. He could fight, cling to his broken identity, and watch his empire collapse. Or he could humble himself, start over, and perhaps become the man he had always pretended to be. He had no choice. "I understand, sir," Ethan said. Good. The car is leaving at dawn. Be ready. Patrick left, leaving Ethan and Genevieve alone. The silence was different now. It was no longer a chasm, but a bridge. Ethan walked over to Genevieve, not touching her. He just stood looking at her, seeing her for the first time as the person she truly was. A woman of immense strength and grace. He had spent a decade looking for a trophy, and had failed to see the treasure he had already found. I have a lot to make up for, Ethan said, his voice laced with newfound humility. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me. Someday. Genevieve gave a small, sad smile. Forgiveness is a journey, Ethan. We'll see where it leads. She walked to the other side of the room, preparing for the long night. Ethan stood there, looking at the woman he had wronged, who had always been a rock in the storm he created. He had lost everything, but in that loss, he had a chance to find something infinitely more valuable. The journey had just begun. The first few months were a brutal lesson in humility for Ethan Carlyle. The man who had lived his life in designer suits now wore jeans and work boots. He traded his private jet for a beat-up Ford pickup and his mahogany desk for a plot of land with his father-in-law, Patrick. Ethan's days were now spent in physical labor, his hands covered in calluses, his body aching from work he had never known. He was no longer a CEO. He was an apprentice, learning the true value of a tree of the land and of the people who worked it. Patrick. The man Ethan had once dismissed as a simple farmer was a master teacher. He didn't just teach Ethan about timber and land management. He taught him about life. He spoke of integrity, of earning respect, and of the quiet satisfaction of seeing a tangible result of his own labor. Ethan's home was no longer the silent, lonely suite, but a rustic cabin with a wood-burning fireplace. He and Genevieve spoke every night, their conversations shifting from business to the small details of their lives. He would tell her about the satisfaction of felling a difficult tree, and she would tell him about her work at the community center. He was finally talking to her as a person, not as a symbol. He was beginning to fall in love with her all over again, not with the idea of her, but with the reality of who she was. After 6 months, Patrick brought him to a modest old office building. Ethan expected a desk, but instead he was introduced to a man behind a simple wooden desk, Vincent Caldwell. "Vincent," Ethan said, stunned. "What are you doing here?" Vincent shook his hand. "Patrick offered me a partnership. Turns out he has a few more assets than I thought." He gestured to a whiteboard covered in names of companies Ethan had tried and failed to acquire over the years. Companies that had mysteriously and repeatedly rebuffed his offers. Patrick had been the owner all along. The man he had mocked was a business genius of a completely different order. Patrick built things grew, things invested in things that mattered. He wasn't a spectacle. He was a force of nature. A full, grueling, humbling year passed. Ethan had worked harder than he ever had in his life. He had learned the true value of an honest dollar, a word, and a handshake. The arrogance had been replaced by a quiet confidence. The hollowness had been filled with a genuine purpose. On the anniversary of his test, Patrick and Genevieve came to the cabin. Genevieve was in a simple dress, her hair in a single braid. She looked more beautiful to him now than she ever had in all the diamonds and silk of their previous life. "You've earned my respect, son," Patrick said, a rare warmth in his voice. "And my trust." He handed Ethan a manila folder. "This is a contract, a partnership, and a marriage license." Ethan looked at the documents, his heart pounding. The partnership was a new venture, combining his business acumen with Patrick's wisdom. The marriage license was a promise of a new beginning, a chance for him to truly marry Genevieve, not for her appearance, but for her character. Ethan turned to Genevieve, his eyes filled with a new love and deep respect. He didn't need a public statement or a grand gesture. He just needed to be a man worthy of her. "Genevieve," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I spent a decade trying to turn you into something you're not, and I almost lost the best thing that ever happened to me. I'm not the man you married, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be the man you deserve." Genevieve's eyes filled with tears, and she walked into his arms, a quiet act of forgiveness, more powerful than any public declaration. The ring was gone, but the love in her heart was real. The man she had married was gone, but the man before her was one she could truly love. A man of substance, not of spectacle. The quiet, broken billionaire had finally found what he was looking for, not in the money he had always chased, but in the love he had almost lost forever. Ethan's story is a powerful reminder that true wealth isn't measured in dollar signs or public accolades. It's found in the quiet, unassuming grace of people like Genevieve, and in the wisdom of those who, like Patrick, have built their empires on a foundation of character and integrity. The billionaire's shame wasn't the loss of his reputation, but the revelation that his entire life was a performance. His redemption wasn't in reclaiming his fortune, but in discovering a different, more meaningful kind of wealth, one built on humility, hard work, and the unwavering love of the woman he almost lost. If you were moved by this story, if it made you think about what truly matters, then hit that like button. Share this with a friend who needs a powerful dose of reality. And for more real-life stories about drama, redemption, and life-changing moments, be sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Your support helps us keep these stories coming. Thank you for listening.